Hello everybody. So we return to continue with our series on sociology and concepts, the concepts that we use in sociology. And today we're going to discuss the concept of the individual. Usually in textbooks you have the concept of groups, which you begin with, concept of self, status, concept of role. I decided to begin with the concept of individual because very fundamental to sociology, to any kind of sociological theorization, is the relationship between the individual and society, between what is called the agency and social structure, between the issue of human choice or human volition and social or structural constraint. So the individual, it becomes extremely important. So the subtitle is Self and Society, Society and Selfhood. So I again want to flag off the dynamic relationship that exists between the individual and society. It is not one or the other. It is the mutual reciprocity or the mutual determination and influence on each other, the constitutive nature of self and society that I would like to focus upon today. You would notice that every time I give a lecture, I normally do a quick recap of my earlier lectures before I address the topic of the day. And there are good reasons for this. One fundamental reason is that society is a whole. It's an interconnected whole. It has its parts and therefore it cannot be studied in fragments. We cannot isolate one part saying that we are going to study family and we are not going to study politics, or we are going to study kinship and we are not going to study the market. These are interrelated. Therefore, the concepts that we use or deploy to understand society must also be understood in connection with other concepts. What is the relationship between one concept and the other concept? For concepts exist not so that we can memorize, redefine and reproduce. Concepts are fundamental to the practice of sociology. They are our windows to see society. They are our lenses to make sense of what is not apparent at the surface level. Remember the point that I had mentioned and reiterated in my early lecture: defining concept is not equal to understanding concepts. Concepts exist so they can interrogate and challenge the taken for granted, the common sense ideas that we have about any concept, including the sociological concept. Sociological concepts are different from common sense concepts because common sense concepts are useful. They help us to orient. They help us to negotiate in everyday life, but they do not have the interrogative possibility within it. Common sense concepts are also spatially and temporally context specific, whereas the sociological approach is basically comparative, always looking at the possibilities of different kinds of ideas existing in different kinds of society. There are other lectures which I've given in this series. I began with concepts in sociology, moved to common sense and sociological concept, then the concept of structure and the concept of culture. If you notice, when we talk about the structure and the culture, we assume that the individual is located within a structure or within the culture. So when we take the concept of individual, the topic of the day, again, I go back to the reiterated idea of the fact that we already have ideas and preconception as members of society, ideas about the individual, ideas about selfhood. In modern societies, for example, very often we assume that the individual is agential. The individual has their own kinds of possibilities of choice and action and freedom to take their own decision. In traditional society, on the other hand, the assumption is that the individual is defined by the multiple relationship that the individual has to kin, to family, to clan, to tribe, to society as a whole. So the very idea of the individual is context specific. This is fundamental to the sociological approach, that no idea, no concept is contextless, is no idea or no concept is free of history. It is historically embedded. In modern Western societies, for instance, it is assumed, as it is in modern Indian or other South Asian societies, the individual is an autonomous agential entity. In traditional society, the self is often seen as relational. In societies like ours, which are modern in some ways and deeply traditional in some other ways, very often the self is pulled in multiple directions. The desire to be an individuated, individualized entity, to exercise freedom as an individual, it coexists with the pulls and pressures of the family, of parents, of other kin, siblings, etc. For example, many of you who are young very often are pressurized to take up employment opportunity or a career opportunity, not because you wish to or like to or are free to, but because the larger family, kin group and the community expects that of you. So the idea of the individual, as you can see in your own experiential life, is something which is socially constructed. Again, the idea of social construction becomes extremely important in sociology. I want to move a little more to a related point, a point that I have made earlier too, that because there has been a dominance in the modern period by Western societies, that very often the ideas of those societies, including the common sense ideas which exist in those societies, have made their presence felt or have influenced the realm or field of intellectual ideas too. Thus, modern ideas of the individual, as evident in the modern West, has been unself-consciously extended to the production of social science concept. I am drawing from two entries in the extraordinarily well done Stanford philosophy encyclopedia, and they refer to the individual as one entity among the larger group of biological world, as containing of many kinds of individuals, including mushrooms, ants, etc. But at the ground level, and this is what is important for us from the point of this encyclopedic entry, biological individuals are physically bounded, relatively well integrated, autonomous agents, the one listed being amongst those that can readily be detected with the senses. So there's a taken for granted idea even when it comes to sociologically conceptualizing the individual, autonomous agent. But as people who would like to use concepts as tools to interrogate and question, I ask, is this the matter of autonomous agents and individuals something we can accept, or is the empirical world within which most of us have grown up, say, a very different idea of the individuals in our parts of the world? And I quote over here, "From the time they can talk, if not before, Indian children learn that they are part of a multiplex family network. People, whether kin or not, are more often addressed by kin terms than by name. In Tamil, a major Indian language, there are over a dozen central kin terms. When one meets a person, one chooses what kin terms to call them, and with each kin term goes a complex set of ways to behave. For example, if you are introduced to somebody and somebody says that so-and-so is your chacha, paternal uncle, even this though it may be a putative relationship, you are expected to behave accordingly, whether as a nephew or a niece, to that uncle or to the category of chacha. Maybe if it is the elder brother of your father, the Taya in North Indian terminology, would be very, very different. So the idea that terminology, relationship, individual behavior, ideas and norms all become part of one closely knit set of complex behavior and value practices. The point that is fundamental to sociology, therefore, is that the way we think is not something that we think because we are unique as individuals, but to recognize that unique as we may be in many ways, eccentric behavior, particular kinds of likings for certain kind of tastes, etc., we have to recognize when we enter the realm of the social sciences that human thought is social. Human thought is consummately social, social in its origins, social in its function, social in its forms, social in its applications. And as Clifford gets right, thinking, therefore, is a public activity. Natural habitat of thinking is not necessarily the university or your college or your school or your coaching center, but it could be the house yard, the marketplace, the town square. The implication of this fact for the anthropological analysis of culture, my concern here, that is Git's concern here, are enormous. We have to appreciate that human thought is social, so individual thought is social. Therefore, the individual is social entity. What is it which makes us, the individual, a social entity and not something which is a random, accidental phenomena? We notice, we borrow from Durkheim's rules of sociological method, and I have discussed this earlier lecture on Durkheim. He says that when we observe how children are brought up, we notice how obviously we impose upon the child ways of seeing, thinking, acting, which he himself would not have arrived at spontaneously. Again, I would like to draw your attention to, as I have drawn multiple occasions earlier, that many of these thinkers and writers use he in a kind of gender-blind fashion because the assumption with which they operated, the acting individual is always a he. Therefore, my plea to you that when you read concepts in sociology, whether the individual or later lecture which we'll discuss groups or roles or status or maybe significant others, you have to understand that the concepts are something which we have to deploy in order to understand how society is constituted. So the child is taught that they can only be hungry at particular points of time. They must go to sleep at particular points of time. They must bathe at particular points of time. They must go to the toilet at particular points of time. They can play at particular points of time. They must study at particular points of time. This is not natural. There's nothing inherited or intrinsic or biological about it. It is socially constituted. It is this which makes us habitual people, making of habits. From the earliest year, we oblige, this is Durkheim speaking, him to eat, drink, and sleep at regular hours, observe cleanliness, calm, and obedience. Later, we force him to learn how to be mindful of others, to respect customs and conventions, and to work. If this constraint in time ceases to be felt, it is because it gradually gives rise to habits, to inner tendencies which render it superfluous, but they supplant the constraint only because they are derived from it. This I would like to draw your attention to, that very often we don't feel we are constrained. We would laugh at the idea if we say, look, I'm doing this because it's just natural to me. Nothing is natural to me. The fact that I come 2:30 at a particular date to give a lecture here is not natural. It's socially constrained. I have been given a slot, a time to come and speak. I have been given a series within which I will be able to teach. There are existing syllabus on concepts upon which I should draw upon for you to make sense of. Now, I become habitual to give lectures because all my life I have given lectures. But this is not something internal. It is repeated, habitual work which has made me, the individual, somehow a natural lecturer or a propensity to give natural lectures, because that's what I've done most of my life. The individual, the personal obligations given or learned. Very often you feel that what I'm doing as a daughter, as a sister, as a teacher, as a friend is something which is inherent in me. It is because I wish to do it. And Durkheim again pinpoints that when I fulfill my obligations as a brother, husband or citizens, when I execute my contracts, I perform duties which are defined externally to myself and my acts, in law and in custom, even if they conform to my own sentiments and I feel their reality subjectively, which reality is still objective, for I did not create them. I merely inherited them through my education. So as I grew up, I learned to be greatly attached to my parents, to my siblings, to my cousins, later to my friends, to my class fellows, and much later to my students. I may feel this is something which is stemming from my inner self, something which I've inherited, but that is not right, because I have inherited it, but not biologically, but socially, through my socialization, through my education, through what I learned of what is expected of me as a woman, as somebody who is a teacher, the whole idea of multiple roles within which we as incumbents operate. I now want to also draw your attention to the fact that the idea of the individual or the concept of the individual is extremely important in sociology, because at one level, we take ourselves as taken for granted entities. We also take ourselves as some things which are autonomous and self-contained. We also assume that many of the problems which we face in our private lives as individuals are those problems which may have inflicted people and individuals in other societies in different historical times. Sociologist C. Wright Mills, however, would disagree, and they make a distinction between, as Durkheim would or as most sociologists would, that the self of the individual is very different in modernity. The kind of tension, anxiety, troubles which we face in the modern world is very, very different. And as Peter Berger would say, that the burden of choice in modernity is a burden indeed, because we are free to choose. We are plagued by various kinds of anxieties. It's not mechanical that I grow up, there's puberty, and once there's puberty, you must marry, and once you marry, you must have children, and once you have children, you have to continue to make sure that they are fed and cleaned. You have to earn your living, and you continue, and then you have to get your children married, and then you have your grandchildren. You have obligations as a grandmother, you have obligations as a mother. It's a world where the roles are specified. Modernity is influenced by dramatic social change and transformation. Uncertainty, the point which we have referred to in earlier lectures, alienation by Marx, estrangement by Weber, anomie by Durkheim. There's a sense that our bearings are lost. How do we negotiate in this? How does the individual operate with the sense of being trapped? That we don't know where we are going. We don't know how to escape this. And Mills further argues that our worlds, our immediate worlds as individuals in the modern world, are limited. So I would know my family, I would know my neighborhood. In modern cities like Delhi, in metropolitan cities, you barely know even the people who live in the next door apartment or next door flat. We don't know who they are, we don't interact. And we have to make sense of our anxieties with reference to the few individuals we interact in a familial life or in a work life. We try to make sense within our private orbits. We then, however, vaguely we feel that we are being trapped, and we don't seem to have a sense of how we are going to escape this kind of sense of being trapped. We are unable as lay people to make the connection between history and biography, society and selfhood. We feel what is plaguing us our very own. It could be a failed relationship, it could be a bad job experience, it could be a fallout within the family, and we feel this is uniquely ours, this is our individual problem. C. Wright Mills says that's not how it is. The idea of what we are plagued or our biography are defined by larger macro structural changes, by history and political economy. The facts of contemporary history are also facts about the success and the failure of individual men, individual women. When a society is industrialized, a peasant becomes a worker. When a feudal lord is liquidated or becomes a businessman. So what happens to us at the individual level is socially constituted. And the social can't be understood only in a fragmentary sense. It has to be understood of how it is shaped by politics, international relations, geopolitics, economics, trade, war, peace, various kinds of processes. And these macro processes impinge on our micro selves. History and biography. When classes rise or fall, a man is employed or unemployed. For example, during the COVID period, we saw the precarity of labor, which continues. In a neoliberal regime, many of the problems of casual labor or what is called footloose labor, retreat of any regular employment, retreat of pension or any kind of state assurance of protecting the individual had got accentuated. So when you have these macro changes taking place, you also have changes impacting unemployment, underemployment, casualized unemployment, including casualization within the academia, within the colleges, universities, schools have risen. So it's not just security guards now who would be employed casually through a subcontractor. The same is going to be played out globally within the academic world. So what is troubling us in a precarious academic world market or market is something which is also part of the larger scale of history and politics. World history and everyday predicaments are therefore closely related, and we have to make sense of this complex interplay. Many of us are unable as lay people to make this connection between biography and history. They cannot cope with their personal troubles in such ways as to control the structural transformation that usually lie behind that. To do that, we have to enter the realm of sociological imagination, and to have a sociological imagination, we have to understand the basic concepts of how the individual is related to society. I will be discussing this perspective at greater length in the next lecture. Thank you.